Welcome to the distinguished speakers, visiting speakers in the Art of the Spanish America series. I'm Rosario Granados, the Marilyn Thoma Associate Curator of the Art of the Spanish Americas at the Blanton Museum of Art. And it is my honor to welcome two fantastic scholars that are going to join us today to talk about different ways in which we can reframe the history of the colonial past in Latin America. Luisa Elena Alcalá and Matthew Restall. And now I'm going to let you with Susan Dean Smith, my co-organizer of this series. You know, if you have joined us before, that this series is possible thanks to the support of the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts, and the School of Architecture. And without further ado, I leave you, Susan, with the introductions so we can start the webinar right away.
All right.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Rosario. And thank you for all of those who have joined us for what promises to be a very stimulating discussion with Coco Alcalá and Matthew Restall. Before we begin our discussion, just a few notes about format for the webinar very quickly. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you, and only the panelists are visible on screen. Closed captioning is available by clicking the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking your questions from the Q&A window. Just click the icon below to type and send your questions. Feel free to make comments in the chat window, but please remember to ask your questions through the Q&A box. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube page approximately 1 day from, very quick, 1 week from today. So it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Matthew Restall, who is the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of History, Anthropology, and Women's Studies, and Director of Latin American Studies at Penn State University. He has published over 20 books and 80 essays and articles on colonial Mexico, with an emphasis on the Maya region. His latest book on conquest history, When Moctezuma Met Cortez, was published by Echo Harper Collins in 2018. And before you begin, Matthew, I would say just how influential your work has been on the field, and particularly on my own work as well. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody who's participating here. I am going to talk. You're just going to see my face. I don't have a nice, glamorous PowerPoint, and I'm going to talk for a little bit less time than Dr. Coco Alcalá, who follows me. So I'm kind of the support act. She's the main band, or if you like, I'm John the Baptist. I guess that makes her Jesus, or you can pick your metaphor. And I have a title which I've now forgotten, which I gave to Susan, but it doesn't matter. But what I'm going to say is built around 3 words, and I'm going to put them in the chat as there's the first one, vocabulary. 3 words is a sort of a mnemonic thing for me, but also to help you follow the next 5 or 10 minutes as I talk through this. So these are the 3 words that for me are kind of entry points into thinking about the large and complicated topic that we're talking about in this next hour. So this first one, vocabulary, what do I mean by vocabulary? This gets us into the very sort of tricky, thorny issue of terminology. And you are all going to immediately realize that there's a larger question here that has been going on for decades, that and you might want to simplify it and think of it in terms of political correctness or incorrectness. or wokeness, or whatever word you want to use. So while I recognize that larger debate is relevant, I would encourage you to kind of think more narrowly about the study of colonial Latin America and how the words we use resonate with the people who are hearing or reading those words. I'm being very vague so far, so let me be a little bit more specific. I think the difficult words are the ones that I call in the middle, the terms in the middle. So let me narrow it down now to thinking about indigenous peoples and how we talk and write about indigenous peoples during the colonial period. What do I mean by the terms in the middle? Well, on either side of the middle is the really big term, which is that they're human beings. They're human beings like us, and many occasions when we are writing about them, it is better for various reasons, not least of which just simple accuracy and the clarity of communication, to talk about them as being human beings like us. And at the other end of the spectrum, or the other side of the middle, there's a kind of a bad sandwich metaphor that I sometimes use here that I'll try to avoid. But on the other side, are there specific identities, particularly their names? So if we are able to access that level of detail of an individual indigenous person and can use their name, then that is always preferable to using the terms in the middle that I'm going to get to. And I do understand that, all of this is complicated. And when we talk about someone's name, it might be a name that is assigned to them by somebody else, and we don't know what their name is and so on. And when we come to talking about African-born people who are sucked into the transatlantic slave trade and then living in the Americas as slaves with names assigned to them, it gets even more thorny. But as long as we are thinking about these issues, then I think that's the main thing. So what are the terms in the middle? Well, the term that I can't believe people still use, that I think should be avoided at all costs, is Indian. And the fact that in North America, there are indigenous peoples who self-identify as Indian and the term is considered acceptable is not a good enough reason to use it when we're talking about Latin America. And not simply just because of the argument that, well, we're talking about a different geographical reason and a different history. I think there's a sense in which we have to be conscious of terminology and theories and other forms of analysis coming from let's call it the Anglo world, that are being applied to Latin America, that are themselves therefore a form of recolonization or neocolonization. I might be getting myself into a little bit of trouble here, I realize, but a kind of a sort of a parallel argument and problem is the use of the phrase settler colonialism to apply to Latin America, as if this is some kind of new idea that's incredibly useful and helps us to better kind of understand colonial Latin America and kind of move us forward. It is not. It is a phrase that comes out of the Anglo world. If you kind of go back and look and see how it actually is defined in the origins of that term, it simply does not apply to colonial Latin America. In fact, does a terrible disservice to indigenous peoples in Spanish America and in Brazil, who are not displaced by settlers. So it leads down a very wrong kind of path. And I would say, kind of simply put, that Indian is the same, gets us into the same kind of trouble. So I'm not going to kind of go on. I think I've said enough on this particular point that you can all kind of, in your minds, have your own objections and see how terms can be kind of rethought. I just would say one thing, that I think there's one more thing before I move on to the next word. I don't think that there's any term that we use that it's not useful to keep thinking about and debating and discussing. So a lot of the terms that I don't use anymore, or I'm starting not to use, native is one of them. Sometimes I've decided it's okay to use it now with a capital, the first letter capitalized, or sometimes I decide it's not okay to use it at all. But I have used terms in my past work, which I no longer use, right? So I think that's important to kind of keep an open mind and realize that you might change your mind. You might go back to that before, as long as we're all talking about it and realizing that these things really, really matter. I'm kind of going around in circles a little bit here, but the last term that I wanted to throw out there is one that I have used uncritically in everything where I've ever used this term is the word slave. So you might think, well, this is taking it way too far. Well, we can't use the word slave now. I'm not saying we can't use the word slave. What I'm saying is I think it has been used uncritically, and we have become used to using it uncritically, because like so many other terms, you could argue like the word Indian, we have inherited this term from people who are actively involved in the process of imperialism and colonization in the Americas. And then we've inherited it from previous scholars without really kind of thinking about it. And the fact that it was used at the time and was used by people who were slaves and was used by people for whom that label attached to them was incredibly important to them, was kind of a defining aspect of their lives and the thing that they most wanted to kind of get rid of as part of their identity. That doesn't mean that we can just use the word slave without kind of thinking about it and thinking about how slavery among indigenous societies is not the same as slavery among Iberian societies. It's not the same in the 16th as it is in the 18th century, and so on. So I think if we just pause and think about all of the terms that we're using, it takes us in kind of new and important directions. Okay, I'm going to flog to that one. I'm going to go to the next word now. There's a typo. Brilliant. Okay, discipline. I think you can probably figure out what that is. So I don't mean discipline as in, maybe I should show a little bit more self-discipline in my typing. I mean discipline as in history, anthropology, art history, and so on. This is, pretty obvious, but sometimes when we're talking about decolonization, there are things that are just so kind of obvious that are right in front of us. I don't have a good solution to this, but I think probably everybody listening and watching knows what I'm going to say here. Our disciplines were created in the 19th century in the era that was the heyday of imperialism and colonization. So for the study of colonial Latin America, there's a huge problem, which is this big line that was created by the colonists and so on, saying if you study anything pre-colonial, you have to be in a completely different discipline. And after that, you can be in history, because history is defined by when Europeans are there, and it's defined by kinds of sources and writing and so on. So, everybody in the field knows that that's sort of doesn't apply anymore, and yet we're still stuck within our disciplines, and it represents an ongoing problem that we are constantly, as scholars, having to kind of deal with and climb over this barrier. As I said, I don't have a really good solution to it. I think the idea of area studies has been tried before. I'm not sure if that's really a solution, but I think it's important for us to realize how this impacts the larger perception of whatever topic it is that we're trying to communicate to a larger audience, whether it is something to do with indigenous history, sort of battling against negative stereotypes about the Aztecs, or the idea that the Mayas have all disappeared and their cities collapsed and they're all gone, or whatever it is. These larger ideas there that we don't sort of debate very much among ourselves, but are still very much a part of the greater popular perception of indigenous peoples. Or you could make similar kinds of arguments about Africans and African descended peoples in the Americas and the kind of stereotypes there. The 1619 project kind of is a wonderful thing that also raises all kinds of issues for those of us that study colonial Latin America, and all the many people that have written thousands and thousands of pages on Africans and their descendants in the Americas prior to 1619, right? So there are kind of larger perceptions out there that are constantly being sort of perpetuated and reified and reaffirmed. And part of the problem that we have in battling against that is this disciplinary wall. So that's sort of number two of the simple responses, or how do we deal with decolonization? How are we going to discuss this? What does this word even mean for us and what we're doing? So number one, vocabulary. Number two, discipline. Number three, let's see if I can do this without a typo. I did it. Narrative. Okay, maybe this is not quite so obvious. Now, I don't want to make this about my work at all, except the easiest way for me to talk about this is just to use two examples of things that I'm doing. And then all of you will have your own examples in your minds of the work you've done or read, and you'll see how this applies. When I was in the early stages of working on my most recent book on the conquest of Mexico, and the conquest of Mexico is itself, I have to kind of do that, right, as a phrase to be unpacked and pulled to pieces. But when I was working on that book, the title of which ended up being When Montezuma Met Cortez, when it was being shopped around to presses, some editors at presses, including extremely accomplished senior editors of commercial presses, said, I would not be able to publish this book unless it's restructured as a narrative. What do you mean as a narrative? Well, there's a story there. You have to tell the story. People won't be able to follow the arguments unless you tell it as a story. So my response is, that's a deal breaker for me. I'm very kind of open to making changes and so on, but that's a deal breaker because part of the whole point of writing a new book about a really well-studied subject is that the narrative is itself a trap. And it's a trap that once you're in it, you are then, it's almost impossible to escape the triumphalist narrative of the West. So whether we're talking about the conquest of Mexico or you pick your own topic, if you don't watch out for the way in which that story has been told before, you slide right back into that big, larger narrative. Again, the triumphalist narrative of the West, in which our entire last 500 years of history, including the colonial Latin American period that we study in whatever discipline, is simply part of this kind of inevitable triumph of European colonialism and so on. So in order to see things differently, in order to, if you want, decolonize what it is that we do, you've got to get around that narrative. So when Montezuma met Cortez, it tells that story repeatedly in different ways in different moments. But yes, it's not as easy to read. If you don't know anything about that subject, it's not as accessible as it otherwise might be, because I don't kind of tell the story in that conventional way. But there's a really good reason why I did it that way. So would I claim that here I was 5 years ago, whatever, before we were all using decolonization? Was I anticipating everything and trying to decolonize the subject? No, I'm not gonna claim that. It was only afterwards when people started saying, "Oh, you're kind of like decolonizing the conquest of Mexico." But, oh yes, goodness, I guess I am. Thank you for pointing that out. It certainly strikes me that way now. The other example is one that more of you might be able to relate to, and that is that I sometimes teach a world history class with hundreds of undergraduates. So the history of the entire world, the last 500 years, it's sort of a ridiculous thing to have to do, right? But how do I get around that issue of the triumphalist narrative? I don't go chronologically. There are others who do this around the country and in other countries as well, teaching world history just by theme. So I have 13 themes. Yes, the sort of starting one is empire, but some of the other ones are, health, gender, music, revolution, and so on. And then I tell within each theme, there's a narrative, but the entire history of the last 500 years is not told as a narrative. And that is designed exactly to undermine this perception that undergraduates might have as they come into the classroom of a triumphalist narrative. Hopefully, it's like some small little contribution to kind of decolonizing the way in which they see the history of the last 500 years. Thank you for listening. I'm very curious as to see how people react to anything that I've said. And I am now going to turn off my camera mute and look forward to what Dr. Coco Alcalá has to say. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you. And I'll give you your title back in the spirit of decolonization, which was How to Decolonize Our Field, 3 words, which you expressed beautifully. And so many issues that we have here. We are going to save the questions or my individual questions until after Coco's presentation. So we will move on to listen to Coco Alcalá, who is Associate Professor in the Department of the History and Theory of Art of the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid. Her research focuses on Latin American colonial art, especially the relationship between visual culture and religious practices, taste and patronage, and with an emphasis on the Jesuits as major players in the circulation of art in the early modern period. And Coco is going to talk about reflections on a major exhibition which just closed recently at the Prado, Torna Viaje, or Return Journey. And we're looking forward to your comments, Coco.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you also to Rosario for the invitation to participate in today's panel, and to Professor Restall for really laying down some important groundwork about how we talk about the colonial past. I have the feeling that the reason I've suggested this topic for the talk is that since I'm here in Madrid, this is where I live, I think I can perhaps bring to the table a little bit more about a sense how colonial art specifically is experienced here in Spain, how that might be different from the kinds of questions and ideas that sometimes circulate in the United States or even in other countries in Latin America. I think the important thing here is to realize that there is no one story, right? And the experience of the colonial past is today very different throughout the world. So I prepared a brief PowerPoint that I'm going to share with all of you. I'm going to start by noting the problem of invisibility of colonial art in Spain in today's world. And this is something that I've been keenly aware about over the last 20 years that I've been living here. In fact, I currently collaborate in a research project, which is what you have on the screen, called América en Madrid, which is trying to work towards pushing for greater visibility of this patrimony, both in academic circles and for a more general audience in Spain. However, this issue of visibility is not one that I think we can reduce to a simple statement about absence either, and it really depends whether it exists, a sense for the Latin American viceregal colonial world, whether that exists in Spain or not, depends on the context in which we're talking. Obviously, in academia, for most of the 20th century, colonial art has been present as a subject in the discipline in many university departments. However, I would say that today it is gaining ground, and it's interesting that it's gaining ground both on its own and because of the way in which Spanish art has changed, and there's now a more shared global sense of Hispanic art history, along the lines of what is often called historias compartidas, or connected histories, which, as we all know, is not the same as imperial history. And I think this is wonderful, I think, this development, because it means that scholars who were previously not interested or engaged with viceregal art are discovering it. And I do think that's sort of a good game changer in the long term. Another context of presence or absence has to do with institutions, both museums and exhibitions. And of course, there we must remember the Museo de América on the screen as one of the world's most important repositories of viceregal art. But the reality, as I think many people in this audience know, is that many Spaniards, most Madrileños, never visit this museum, or hardly ever. And in general, they are ignorant about many aspects of their colonial past and the artwork that was produced in Latin America in those 300 years. So museums are well aware of this, and over decades, they organize exhibitions to try and draw attention to the theme. And because of time constraints, I'm not going to discuss all the different kinds of exhibitions that have gone on, but I will just, in this screen that you're looking at, share, I think, what I think were perhaps 3 of the major exhibitions of the last 30 years held in Madrid museums. They're different in many respects, but I would say that the earlier ones, both the exhibition in 1999 and the 2011 exhibition of Identidades Compartidas, Pintura de los Reinos. Both of those shows had a lot of loans that came from museums and collections from Latin America. They were major blockbusters, and they tried to draw attention in this way. The third one on the right is the one that I'm going to dwell on for a few minutes, since it's the most recent. And I think what's interesting is also to talk about the present right now. Of course, all of these exhibitions tried to impact on how Spaniards considered colonial art, whether they knew something about it or not. At the same time, of course, they tried to make contributions internationally and in academic circles. So Tornaviaje, which is the most recent, is an exhibition that has just closed in the Museo del Prado. It was curated by Rafael López Guzmán from the University of Granada, along with 2 colleagues in Mexico, Jaime Cuadriello and Pablo Amador. And this exhibition had a very specific theme. It was about the return journey of objects and images from the viceroyalties to Spain. And as I'm sure much of our audience knows, because it was presented this way in the press, the aim of the show was to communicate to Spaniards that there is a lot of colonial art still in this country, in practically every church, town, and in many public and private collections, and that this is because of the many ways in which Spaniards in the past were connected to the viceroyalties and vice versa. In other words, the exhibition was largely aimed at a Spanish audience to raise awareness of this art here and redress this incredible invisibility and ignorance. And I think important in that respect is that this apparently simple message was voiced from the Prado Museum. It is not the same if the Museo de América says this as if the Prado does. And I think that we all know that, and that if you think back a decade or so, it was the same there in the United States, right? Until museums like the Metropolitan in New York, LACMA in Los Angeles, or the MFA in Boston got involved with Latin American colonial art. The field was, and the overall awareness in the US about viceregal art was quite limited, right, despite tremendous academic efforts. So as an observer, I have to say that I'm hopeful, and I think that Tornaviaje seems to have done some good, although, of course, we are only in the immediate aftermath since the exhibition closed in February, and it's very difficult to know if the effects will be long-lasting. But there are some interesting developments right now. For example, the art market is booming. That's been going on for a while, but the difference is that for once, not all colonial works of note are leaving Spain. For years now, viceregal art in the Spanish art market has mostly left the country, often with a destiny in museums in the United States. Right now, this continues to happen, but the government is also more aware that it should take action and aid museums, especially the Museo de América, in acquiring important works that have been part of the local landscape for centuries. More importantly, after dismantling the exhibition, the home institutions of some of these works have decided to give them greater visibility in their collections. There are a few of the works that were shown that were usually hidden, were in storage, or were in places that were not public, and now they're kind of coming out. Finally, people in general seem to have discovered something in Tornaviaje, and that was my impression, taking students, colleagues, friends through the exhibition, asking after reactions, and yes, I have to confess, doing a little bit of spying in the galleries, overhearing people's comments. I'm sure I'm not the only one who does this when visiting exhibitions. They could not believe that practically every work came from a small Spanish town and that these were not just places in Andalusia. For perhaps, and I'm going to borrow the title of Professor Restall of your great book, The Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest, and apply them a little bit to colonial art, because one of the myths about colonial art in Spain is that it is really just something that concerns the South, that it's about Andalusia, Seville, and Cádiz as the historic port cities. In this exhibition, an effort was made to bring works from practically every region of Spain, and to the extent that it was possible, it also tried to represent a great variety of objects, artistic traditions, materials, techniques, and points of origin. And also it tried, there was no one overall narrative, but it did try to bring the stories behind the arrival of those objects to light. So Spaniards were shocked. They were really surprised to discover that the Christ that they process, many of the Christs in Easter through the streets, were made in Mexico from corn paste, mostly by indigenous artists in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in this way, the exhibition tried to reconnect people to the objects in their hometowns. Who knew that the largest copy, and here's the sculpture I was talking about, that the largest copy of the Guadalupe icon known to date is in Spain? People were fascinated to find an alligator in the gallery, in itself an engaging object. But what mattered was that it was paired with this exquisite Mexican sculpture of the Virgin of Sorrows. And that pairing evoked the way in which it had been displayed for centuries in a small church in the Canary Islands. There are many of these alligators in Spain, and now people have become more aware that it has something to do with perilous travel, the Atlantic, the Americas, and always coming back to Marian images for compassion and protection. So Tornaviaje tried to show that works came back to Spain for a variety of reasons, some political, having to do with imperial relations and exploitation for sure. And that was most evident in the first exhibition hall. You're looking at Potosí right in front of you. Other accounts of importation concerned the entanglement between commercial and social ambitions. And I find that very interesting that merchants emerge as a particular curious group to study as privileged travelers coming and going across the Atlantic, often stopping in Caribbean ports. The objects in the chapels they supported tended to be eclectic in provenance. And other stories behind the objects exhibited were of a personal and religious nature, having to do with the power of art patronage to generate identities and project them across space, like the story of this lady in Lima connecting her to a small town in the north of Spain. This is one of those works that was restored for the exhibition that has never been shown, and it really is going to fill an important gap in the history of Peruvian portraiture. People are also invited to connect through an aesthetic experience, and by being presented with objects that are visually dazzling, dramatically poignant, elegant, scientifically curious and detailed, and ultimately human about people. What Professor Restall was just saying, that's a very, I think, important issue. And this is also important. What also matters, I think, is that regardless of the theme or the materials, quality was one of the criteria used in the selection process. And I'd say that one of the other 7 myths about colonial art, number 1 on the list, is that viceregal art supposedly does not have quality. And this exhibition, like others before it, tried to dispel that idea and to an extent surprise people for this reason. So to conclude and to connect with Professor Restall's comments and the theme at hand, definitely my impression from Spain is that Spaniards today need to come to terms with their colonial past and to do so in a constructive way in the 21st century. First, they need to know more about it and use some of those categories that my colleague was just discussing. In Spain, this subject is not really even taught. Colonialism, not even colonial art. I'm just talking about the history with Latin America is not taught. And there's just a lot of repetition of stereotypes, especially Black legend or rose-colored legend. They need to understand the kinds of complexities and contradictions involved. And this, to a large extent, the same can be said for colonial art. To understand it, however, though, I believe that first, it needs to be visible. People need to see it here, which is easier said than done. And they also need to want to see it. Undoubtedly, this is an incredibly rich field, partly because of the political context, which invites all sorts of questions about identity, inequality, and negotiation. But also, and I think that's what I want to stress today, it's also a very rich field because of the creativity of so many people in so many different places in that geography: Amerindian, Afro-Indian, Mestizo, Afro-American, well, I'm going to go on and on, mulatto, and the Creole and the Spanish inhabitants of the territory as well. And in today's world, this is what is sometimes missed. In coming to terms with the colonialism of viceregal art and in spreading knowledge about it, I sincerely hope that there will be room for research at the academic level and also artistic appreciation for all, which comes about by giving those objects the history they and their makers deserve. And this, in my view, is not only using them to denounce colonialism, which of course is a given. It is also about appreciating talent, materials, and form, just like we do for the art and craft traditions of all civilizations across the globe in all times. And so I'm just going to end with one anecdote. One day in February, Rosario and I visited Tornaviaje together with our dear friend Paula Mus-Orts. And we stood in front of this work, Juan Correa's vibrant painting of the Virgin of Remedios, recently cleaned, never seen this way before. And we could not help but enthusiastically comment on its artistic qualities, how Correa applied the colors differently in response to the textures and of the textiles he was representing. Deep red lakes for the heavy and luxurious brocade curtains, and a paler, more varied palette using wispy strokes for the embroidered altar front and with these dazzling birds. And then how he so delicately sought to imitate translucent lace flapping over the edge of the altar table and painstakingly deposit over 100 dabs of white to conform the tiny pearls which envelop this virgin sculpture. She's petite. An image that has for centuries meant so much to people, Mexicans today for sure, and ages ago, the indigenous and Spanish inhabitants of early colonial Mexico. So Juan Correa, this is also very important, was a mulatto artist. And of course, one could and should say much about that. But contrary to common assumptions, and here comes another myth about colonial art, that does not necessarily mean that professional advancement was not possible for him in the competitive city of Mexico. To the contrary, Correa was an important and dominant player in the artistic scene, things that are hard for us to wrap our head around. And because of that, I think he would have been most satisfied to know that his work was contemplated centuries later in the Prado for its pictorial quality and his capacity to delight contemporary viewers. So I'm just going to end there.
Thank you so much, Coco. Really outstanding set of reflections and observations. And Matthew, if you can turn your camera on, please, if you would. Where to start? There's some really, really fascinating overlaps here. And perhaps one that we can begin with is the question of narrative and stories, because you're clearly both very concerned with those, and also how the narrative. I really was taken, Matthew, with your framing as narrative as a trap. And one comment, perhaps I'll ask you this question first and then move back to Coco. But one thing that I'm struck about with all of the revisionist history, the revising of the narrative, of course, of which you have been a major scholar in this, there is still, certainly in the US, and I would say outside of the US, but there is this narrative of the heroic Spaniards and Cortez and his, merry band of 400 conquistadors overtoppling this phenomenal Mexica empire is still out there, and it's so tenacious. And so my question to you is, we recognize the trap of the narrative. You've given us an insight into how us as academics can work around that trap, but what about the broader public?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's still out there. And I mean, look, what we're all doing is, it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but we're just pushing these huge boulders up the hill, right? And we're never going to get them to the top. It takes, a lot more than just all of us who are working on it right now. And when I'm asked this, when I'm in audiences where I have, spoken for an hour about Montezuma and Cortez, and I say, well, look, I just told you at the beginning that I have this idea that the story's been wrong for 500 years, and I've anticipated your next thought, which is, how is it that you're so clever that you know the right answer and everybody else has been wrong for 500 years, like thousands and thousands of people? And so I say, yeah, you're right. That I spotted that as a problem when I was writing the book. I'm like, this is never going to work. And that's why half of the book isn't actually about what happened 500 years ago. It explains why the narrative is so deeply rooted. And so when you think of it that way, then people say exactly what you said, Susan. Well, one book's not going to do it. 10, 100 scholars aren't going to do it. What it takes is a constant kind of rethinking of everything, not just that particular topic, but all the larger topics, the things that Coco was just talking about, right? Like the little moments that you were describing, Coco, that's all part of it. This massive, massive kind of unpacking that has to go on all through this century, long after we're all gone. It's like our children, grandchildren, and so on. And we have to accept that we love stories. Human beings love stories. Not only that, but there's actually this kind of core human narrative that we love. And there's a part in my book which I'm always surprised that people don't kind of pick up on, maybe even kind of jab at me and make fun of me about, where I essentially say that the core narrative is that of a romantic comedy. It's a rom-com movie. And that what people want to do is make the conquest of Mexico into a rom-com narrative. And I say, why are people picking up on that? Because there's hundreds of literature scholars have written at length and in very sophisticated analytical ways about this, right? So we're up against that too. The more you complicate the narrative, the more you're up against this tendency, which I suspect probably is sort of, goes back to how our brains are wired through the evolutionary process many hundreds of thousands of years ago, to kind of think in those terms, because that is, in a way, is our experience of our individual lives. I'm not going to outline what that narrative is, because you all know what it is, right? If you think you can actually take your life, Susan, and imagine it to the end as being essentially like the plot of a rom-com, that's how we kind of think of human existence. So it's not really about overturning that. It's about being willing to engage the process of trying to do it.
Yeah.
And accepting that we won't see it overturned in our lifetime. But if people are talking about it,
Yeah.
you know, that's great.
Yeah, no,
I'll take that.
I mean, I agree, absolutely, and I take your point. It's but it is thinking about, as you say, this trap, and the trap of the willingness, but also the want factor. In other words, a resistance to moving away from the unfamiliar. From how we do reframe those narratives. And if I can just move briefly to Coco, one of the emphases that you have that I think is so important, and again, it relates very much to Matthew's discussion, is that there are so many stories to be told that come out of naming, that come out of understanding individual lives that may be in a context of violence and exploitation, oppression, all of the inequalities that we are familiar with. But at the same time, your point, Coco, about a mulatto artist, for example, like Correa, and he is just one example, right? So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you think the multiple stories that art historians uncover help us move away from the trap of the narrative.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Well, I have to say I agree. I agree also with your comment, Matthew. I'm getting there about how this is a long-term process, right? And I also think it's interesting, you know, what is that narrative for the colonial history versus the colonial art history? Because it's surprisingly different, right? You've been talking about the triumph. The narrative for colonial art is the opposite. Often, it's often been, you know, that it is not interesting, that it is derivative, because it was originally seen from the Western lens, or about what canon and what it should look like. So we're pushing that boulder up that hill also for a different reason, a different situation. And I think that the wonderful thing about the objects is that, and more, there's an object-based art history going on, right, everywhere. And I think the wonderful thing about that is if you let the objects tell their stories, you know, they challenge that narrative automatically, because people like Correa, you know, are against the traditional narrative, and they will surprise you. And so I think I always encourage my students, everyone, to do that local research, right, about the local stories, because those are the ones that, if you put enough of them together, end up challenging, you know, easy assumptions always.
Yeah. And on that, another issue that you brought up, Matthew, and it's one that I wrestle with all the time in my own work, is this question of discipline. Because with both you and Coco, we have two representatives of two different disciplines. And how do we overcome those disciplinary boundaries? I mean, I have, obviously we talk to one another and we learn from each other and we learn from each other's work. But I'm also struck by where a lot of traction that we're seeing really very provocative new insights, which is object-based. But I'm thinking about the Getty initiative on materials with Gabriela Siracusano, for example, where this takes a very, this is a collaborative enterprise that takes different expertises, and it's wonderful because it brings to light sources, for example, analysis of pigments, that allow us to build up those stories, that allow us to build up questions of form, content, how Indigenous artisans are using these materials that we could not get from a textual archive. And so I think, I mean, basically the point that I'm really making here is that for kind of one future direction, a lot of that is going to depend on interdisciplinary collaborative work. And with the exception of institutions like the Getty, I don't see that in everyday academia. And I see that as something, as kind of as a lost opportunity. This is more of an observation, necessarily. You don't have to respond to it, but I'm really very struck by where we go from here.
Yeah, I think just to respond to that briefly, I think that while that's true that there are few institutions like the Getty that are able to support that kind of the dimension of those kind of projects, I somehow do feel that we are in a very collaborative moment, to tell you the truth. And collaborative in not just an interdisciplinary way, but also geographically, where we're all working and in group projects. And I find that very, very enriching, really. So I have a more, I think, optimistic view there. I think we're, at least here in Spain, we're constantly compelled, right, to do the interdisciplinary exercise, which is always a little bit of a fallacy, right? Because it's about talking to each other. It's not about assuming that we can exactly do or know how someone trained in a different discipline works.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I did not appreciate the fact that there was a lot that I could learn from art history as a discipline until I was married to an art historian. And that's a little embarrassing. I mean, I'm embarrassed by that. I should be embarrassed by that. And when I talk to my graduate students, or the graduate students that I teach about that, I realize that they already are a step ahead of where I was when I was a grad student in the 1990s, for the reasons that you were just saying, Coco. That there's already an understanding that we have to look out for the arrogance of the discipline and not assume that whatever we are, whether historians or archaeologists or art historians, that therefore that's the best way of thinking about things, and our bodies of theory are superior and so on. And we have to kind of have a kind of a humility, like, look, the people in parallel disciplines have a lot to teach us. And that sounds very kind of, it sounds a little simple-minded, but it's huge. And that was not what I was taught when I was a student.
I think we have two questions in the Q&A, so let me go to those and see what we have. One of our guests, Celeste Ratcliffe, and I think this one is for you, Matthew. The question is, can you steal someone's identification with the tribe if they have access to your tribal connotation?
I did not answer that because I wasn't quite sure what the question meant, so I apologize.
Oh, all right.
To Celeste, sorry.
Oh, all right. Let me move on to the next one. This is from Monica Katz. All right. I'm not sure if this is a question, Monica, more than a statement. Okay. Monica says the V&A in London is organizing a one-day virtual and in-person conference next year called LACA in America that brings together art historians, conservators, and conservation scientists across the historic divide. And she's curious to hear of any other initiatives. Coco, do you have any?
Well, I believe that that I think that the BNA has been collaborating with the Museo de America in Madrid about this lack, or that there's a project behind this, I believe. If our person who's asked it can clarify further if I'm wrong. And that's another example, right? That even smaller institutions, because of the web, because of the way, we communicate today, it is possible to do these things. So, I mean, I look forward to that.
And let me jump into the conversation because it's almost time to wrap up, but also because I think it's important to use this platform to share that we're ready to open Painted Cloth, Fashion and Ritual in Colonial Latin America at the Blanton, which is inspired by the research of these three amazing scholars that we listened today. And it's really an invitation to embrace the contradictions that are embedded in these beautiful objects, and is an invitation also to look very closely, as you did in your presentation, Coco, to see the details and to see how the creative minds of the people in colonial Latin America made sense of a very difficult world, embedded with social injustices and violence. And this is a show that is following what you were saying, Matthew, is based or goes around one topic, which is the representation of textile arts. All the details that you presented, Coco, are really just a little taste of what we are going to be able to see in this show. And I'm so sorry to have to bring this conversation to an end. It was very, very inspiring. And I hope our audience can come to Austin to see the show and have further conversations about this very important topic. The fact also that both in Spain and in the US, the presence of Latin American people, or people that are immigrants from these countries is more evident, I think makes these conversations very timely and very relevant to today's world. So I don't know if you guys want to say something more. We have like 2 minutes before we have to end the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Still so many issues to discuss.
Thank you for inspiring us all. And now we'd like to tell you that we're going to have next month a curated conversation with Ventana Ballet. The composers and choreographers will give us a sneak peek of their new ballet composition entitled Beautiful World, a million tiny gospels, and draw connections between its cosmic characters and artworks from the Blanton's collection, which I think it's another way of encouraging new perspectives is by just looking at different arts, and see what they're doing. Also, I want, as I said before, we are going to be hosting another series of distinguished visiting speakers in the Art of the Spanish America series this fall. And they're going to be in tandem with the exhibition that I just mentioned, and we are going to explore in these webinars in the fall the importance of clothing practices in general, but also we're going to tackle the cultural appropriation of indigenous textile designs. I encourage you to check for updates at our website, blantonmuseum.org/events. And I cannot finish without asking you to consider supporting the Blanton and becoming a member today at blantonmuseum.org/membership. And also, I would like you to sign up for our Blanton news at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe to always be in the know about what's happening at the museum in all many different areas that we cover. And finally, if you have enjoyed today's event, please help us continue to bring quality programming to the community by making a donation at blantonmuseum.org/pay what you wish. Thank you so much again to Matthew and to Luisa Elena Alcalá. It's has been very, very interesting to have you here. Susan, always a pleasure to work in these webinars with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.